Good evening, and thank you for joining us. I'm Linda Barrett, and I'm with the Genealogy, Local History, and Archives Unit of the Fort Worth Public Library. We are honored to host Dr. Dwight Watson for a discussion on King's Path of Social Gospel. Dr. Watson received his MA from Texas Southern University and his PhD from the University of Houston. He is an associate professor of history and assistant to the provost at Texas State University. He specializes in African American and Texas history, and his research interests include Southern and urban history, the civil rights movement, race and law, and the African American church-state relationship. Dr. Watson's first article, In the Name of Progress and Decency, the response of Houston's civic leadership to the 1928 lynching of Robert Powell, was published in the Houston Review of History and Culture in 2004. His book, A Change Did Come, Racial, Social, and Political Transformation of the Houston Police Department, 1930 to 1990, was published in 2005, and he was awarded a grant by the National Endowment for the Humanities for his research. He is currently working on When Hell Came to Houston, African Americans in Houston in 1917. During the presentation, please go ahead and type in any questions as they occur to you, and Dr. Watson will answer them at the end of his presentation. And I'm going to put a few book recommendations in the chat, and I'm going to turn things over to you, Dr. Watson.
Thank you, Linda, for inviting me, and thank the city of Fort Worth and the library system. I am just tickled pink to be here today. I was sick a few years ago, and there was a possibility I wouldn't make it, but faith, hope, and love. And as they say, as Corinthians 13 says, and now about it, faith, hope, love, these three, but the greatest of these is love. Martin Luther King Jr., MLK, was somewhat of an anomaly. First of all, he was a middle-class Black man in the South, born in the 1920s, raised in a household that not only had his mother and father, but also had his grandmother and grandfather until his grandfather died. The most instrumental figure in his life was his grandmother. It is important to note that King was considered a boy genius, having graduated from schools in Atlanta. He went to school at Morehouse College at 15, where he became, where he became the tutor. He was tutored by Benjamin Elijah Mays, who becomes one of the most important figures in his life and his ministry. This talk today centers around the ideas of social gospel, civil rights, and social change. Toward the end, we'll talk about how James Baldwin raises a call to a higher form of transformation in life upon the death of Martin King. The seminal works on Martin King are the book by Taylor Branch, Parting the Waters, David Garrow's book, and then a new book, Martin and Malcolm by Peniel Josephs. James Baldwin, of course, the most prolific, one of the prolific writers of the 1950s and 60s. No Name in the Street, Fire Next Time, and of late, Eddie Glaude, Begin Again, and there is a biography, 2 biographies on him, Talking at the Gate, and the other slips me right now. But it is important for us to understand what Martin was other than a preacher at times. Martin King, having grown up in Atlanta and been part of what we call the Black petty bourgeois, Du Bois and other scholars of the time saw Martin's grandfather as a mover and shaker in Atlanta. In the 1930s, while he was a young man, he would run into some of the great preachers of his day. Vernon Johns, the man that he would take Dexter Avenue from in 1953, 54. Mordecai Johnson, the first Black man appointed president of Howard University, was also a pastor in Atlanta. Benjamin Elijah Mays, president at Morehouse and a pastor. Also, Howard Thurman, the sage, who was considered by some one of the great religious thinkers of our time, and he was dean of Howard University School of Theology. But when King grew up, he grew up in a household that was reminiscent of Southern society. It not only had a mother, a father, it had an extended family unit, much like I grew up with a mother and grandmother and uncles around. And the richness of his life was emboldened by the presence of these people. But not only that, he was a minister's son. And a minister's son in Southern society, particularly African-American society, came with its benefits and privileges, and also a whole lot of responsibility, he would once say. You had to be a gentleman at all times. You had to comport yourself in the presence of ministers who were your elders, he once stated. But what made King think about the idea of ministry as a profession? Number one, I argue, his grandmother, whom he loved so much that upon her death, he throws himself out of a window. Some say he was attempting to kill himself, and I argue that it was just a moment of despair and an effort to draw some attention to his pain. Martin will graduate from Morehouse College. He will be 20 years old when he leaves and goes to Crozer Seminary in Chester, Pennsylvania. Now, Crozer was the center of liberal Christian thought in American society, followed by Rochester Seminary in Colgate Rochester Seminary. And so while at Crozer, King was exposed to different things in life. Number one, Martin King was exposed to billiards. Number two, cigarettes, which he would smoke for the rest of his life. And I remember Nikki Giovanni, when she came to my college, Henderson State undergraduate, she said when the first time she saw Martin King smoke a cigarette, she almost passed out. And so King was, above all things, a regular man. And those who knew him said he had a humility about him. But at Crozer, he was able to look and think and question. And at Crozer, he was encouraged by Reinhold Niebuhr and his writings, which much of Crozer's theology was based on. While there, King began to explore social gospel. But it was not like King had not been introduced to social gospel. Social gospel was one of the came out of one of the quintessential reform movements of the 20th century, the progressive movement. The progressives touched all walks of American life in an effort to transform and change America to fit their middle class image. But progressivism, much like the populist movement and other reform movements of its time, falls way short because it begins to rely on hegemony as a defining theme, and that is the idea that a singular race is the way in which you can advance a society. Walter Rauschenbach, who was a German theologian and philosopher, and Harry Emerson Fosdick were the apostles of this movement of social gospel. Social gospel said that we must take to heart how we treat the least of these, and that the spiritual and the physical life of people must be taken into consideration, and that churches have moved away from the idea of the daily needs of people. And from this early movement, a progressive movement, grows what we call outreach agencies. And these outreach agencies, the YWCA, the YMCA, and others, but very few of them address the needs of African Americans. But W.E.B. Du Bois, who seemed to life expand the first half of the 20th century, himself was a progressive, and he saw benefits in social gospel. He said, by lifting up the least of these and finding within that group those who can be advanced along to take care of the needs of those behind. Walter Rauschenbach said, the problem with social gospel is that society is inherently evil. And because society is inherently evil, the next generation is doomed unless you can stop the evil in the generation before. So essentially, you were running in a circle. And so they sought to strengthen the faith of groups they identified with. And Rauschenbach was a German, and he began to accept the idea that the way that all Christians must follow must be that the way the Germans followed, and that the Aryan race or the Teutons was a race to model our lives by. Well, of course, Benjamin Mays and Mordecai Johnson and others disagreed with that. They accepted social gospel. They accepted social gospel as a useful tool to uplift the church, but they saw it not from a position of one group or another. It was all groups that you can uplift African Americans within the context of what each one teach one, or each one raises up one, and so the next generation will be stronger. Martin King grew up with this juxtaposition, the way African Americans saw social gospel and the way he saw it. But he also studied world religion. And it was world religion and his work with Niebuhr about the presence of evil and the consideration that one must always consider ill will of others. Even though love and hope are the desired outcome, one must always consider it. And Martin was a really deep thinker. As I said, at Crozer, he dabbled in things that he would not have done in the South. And one of those things was playing pool, smoking cigarettes. And when his dad came up to visit with his brother, and Martin took them to the basement and he lit up a cigarette in front of his dad and shot pool with his brother. His brother was afraid because he said when he got back to the hotel, his dad smacked him upside the head for playing pool with Martin. And he couldn't understand. He said, I understood, but I couldn't understand why he hit me and not Martin. Martin King operated from a position of advantage due to two things. One, his superior intellect, and two, an ability to always be able to understand what is next in his life. Now, not what is next in terms of his profession, but what things, the order and structure of things. And so once he leaves Crozer, his father wants him to come back to Atlanta, become associate pastor of the church. When he resigns, he takes over Ebenezer. Well, Martin didn't really want to do that, and he wanted to go to school. So he goes to Boston, and he goes to the seminary in Boston. And while in Boston, Martin works toward his doctorate, and he begins to really look at social gospel and move social gospel foremost in his mind. He says that the church cannot look for the spiritual needs of its congregation and fail to look at the fact that his congregation is hungry. He says that a child cannot do his lesson in school if he or she is starving. He said that it is difficult for a young person to pray and steadfastly believe in God at church, and the church is closed on Monday, and he has nowhere to go and feel safe. But Martin King also came from a Jim Crow society, and all of the new things that Martin was learning at Crozer and in Boston worried his father that Martin's new ideas would become a problem in the Jim Crow South. So Martin dabbles with the idea of interracial love. And his father and mother really had concerns. Where can you take her? You can't bring her to the South. Y'all can't live here. And it was at that point Martin becomes the man he will become. He breaks the relationship off, and he agrees to meet Coretta, his wife, who would later become his wife. And Martin and Coretta will form a relationship because she was kind of a hand-picked young lady who too was from what we call a working middle-class family in the South. And so with that said, Martin appears to have acquired all the accoutrements of a Black professional. But there was a problem. There was very few places for a Black liberal professional thought in the South. And so in 1953, 54, Montgomery, Alabama, Dexter Avenue bought Vernon Johns, one of the great preachers of the gospel. Johns was a person who had never gone to school, decided at 19 that he wanted to go to school. And by the time he was 27, I believe, Vernon Johns had acquired a doctorate in theology and was considered one of the great preachers of the South. But Vernon Johns was also a person who believed speaking truth to power. And that wouldn't work at Dexter Avenue. For Dexter Avenue Church was not ready for what they saw as that radical thought. For Dexter Avenue was a church controlled by the board and the board of trustees and the deacons, and not by the preachers. So in understanding this, let me put it this way. African-American church is one of the only things that African-Americans have owned independent of white control in American society. And it is the most beloved institution. It is the place the majority of people learn to speak, write, and count. If you're from a working class neighborhood like I was growing up, you went to church. You went to church on Saturday, you went to church on Sunday, you had Friday night socials at the church. The church was a center of activity. And so for the church not to be available to people, King thought that was an issue. And so Vernon Johns basically agitated the local authorities to the point that they basically told the Dexter Avenue Church he had to go. And then at the same time, the NAACP and Rosa Parks staged the bus boycott. Parks was a seamstress and secretary of the NAACP, one of the most hated institutions in the South by white Southerners, particularly white citizens' councils. And so they began to look for a preacher, and at the same time, the bus boycott begins. Now, this is a time of high social volatility, high social tension and change. You have Brown versus the Board of Education in the courts. You have the Montgomery bus boycott going on, where they have decided they are going to walk, and they walked for 381 days, and they needed a leader. Well, Dexter Avenue needed a preacher, and they chose King. They chose King because of his oratorical skills and the fact that he was young, and they thought that they could control him. But Martin represented something new in the South. He represented the next generation of college-educated theologians. There were few in the generation before him, but in his generation, the numbers would grow exponentially. In each generation, the number of college-educated Black preachers would expand. And so by choosing Martin, a stranger, to come to Montgomery, Alabama, they thought, one, nobody would know who he was, so he wouldn't be much of a threat. Two, he was young and they could direct him rather than him lead them. But Martin had a skill set that they were not ready for. First of all, Martin had been around preachers all of his life. And the one thing Martin had learned were the rules of order and the rules of conduct of the church. All of his life, he had been with his grandfather and his father in Atlanta, in the heart of the Black elite. In there, he heard some of the great preachers of their time, and he sat in the business meetings, which he says helped him not only as a leader, but helped him to understand how to resolve conflict. And so from the Black church, King garners a set of skills when put together with social gospel will bring about a tremendous force. And so what is the first thing they did? The first thing they did was to organize a way in which people in Montgomery could get around, and they started the jitney service. It's a Jitney, and that's an unofficial cab service. And that jitney service was real important because it began to be the basis of Black businesses, not only in Montgomery, but other places had jitney services where cabs would not come to neighborhoods where African Americans lived. And so King, not only does he help organize the group, he organizes the preachers whose congregants are now walking to work. He uses his oratorical skill to attract more and more people. And one woman said, we had weary feet, but a rested soul. It was important because after 381 days, the NAACP legal case came to fruition and the city of Montgomery was forced to negotiate. One of the first wins for Martin King and what becomes later known as SCLC, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. Now, what does this mean in terms of the movement? Is there a movement? No. The Southern Christian Leadership Conference will grow out of the Montgomery Improvement Association when King and others realize that there is a critical need to organize for a larger civil rights movement in the country. Now, they were not the first. There were other fragmented groups who were leading campaigns to integrate a hospital, to integrate a lunch counter, or to change. For example, in 1948, I believe, Ron Walters and Kansas City or Topeka sit in at the A&P. In Baton Rouge, students at Southern University sat in. And this was way before the lunch counter sit-ins of 1960. But what I'm saying to you was there was a fragmented movement, and King and the Southern Christian leadership will bring some group cohesion. So after the bus boycott, almost simultaneously with the ruling that the city of Montgomery will have to negotiate, comes the ruling of Brown. And King says of Brown, that Brown is the most momentous decision in the history of not just Black folks in America, but all Americans. And what Brown declared, that integration of public schools would go forth with all deliberate speed. Now, those who understood what all deliberate speed meant accepted the victory, but did not or were not as overjoyed about the victory, because all deliberate speed turns out to be 1971 for some Southern schools and 1976 for some Northern schools in terms of the wholesale integration of students. And so using the principles of social gospel, that the church is to take care of not only the spiritual needs, but also the physical needs of their congregants, the intellectual needs. And so what do I mean by that? I grew up in Macedonia Baptist Church in East Little Rock, Arkansas, 4th and Bender. And from the time I was 6 years old, I gave church welcomes at all functions that occurred. And it was quite interesting to me because that was the one thing as a young boy you hated on Sunday evening when the church had a program, because you had to go back to church when all your friends were playing. I would hide from my mother who would make me go. She would find me, whether we were under the house or whatever, she would wash the dirt off the visible parts and force me to go back to church. But what did I learn from church? Much like Martin King, I learned how to stand and look and speak clearly and enunciate my words. I learned to shake hands with a man and look a man in the eye when I talk with him. But most of all, I learned to fear nothing but God. The church was not only the place of salvation, it became the place of liberation. And this is called liberation theology. Martin King was anointed the civil rights leader in American society. But then there were big issues still going on. For example, when he traveled, he had to stay at people's houses because there were very few hotels owned by Blacks that he could stay at. As a matter of fact, as late as 1963, he was staying at people's houses in Houston, Texas, when he came to do a talk. He stayed at Reverend Bill Lawson's house in Houston. And it's important to end Jim Crow was a issue by issue struggle. And so if you take social gospel, the church is to tackle what is unjust and to use the Christian principle in the Beatitudes and in the Pauline letters. And by Pauline letters, those were the letters by the Apostle Paul to the churches that he found. Now, by this time, James Baldwin has heard of King and has read of him and has written several critiques that were very positive to Martin. But Baldwin had not been to the South. But he goes in 1958, and he goes back again in 60s. And he goes in 64, and then he goes at Martin's funeral. Baldwin used his ability to write of Blacks in the North and throughout the country other than the Deep South. And so to give legitimacy to his discussion, he went to the South. And in the South, he said that it felt like the air was on loan. He felt like there was an ever-present pressure to be something other than what you are or were. There was little freedom there, he felt. And he didn't know if believing in God and praying and using Gandhian principles of social gospel, because Gandhi does not become part of the Southern social gospel movement until after the bus boycott, when Jim Lawson comes in and he begins to train the preachers and others in the principles of nonviolent intervention. See, Martin understood this had to be a nonviolent fight. He understood violence. You could see it every day. For example, when he became pastor at Dexter, Emmett Till was murdered. And the murder of Till transformed a generation of people. And they vowed that it would not happen to their children. And so here we are, James Baldwin saying that Martin King is the single most important man, not in the South, but in America. For upon him is the mantle somewhat akin to Christ. He also says that when Martin died, the air seemed to leave the earth. Baldwin says the atmosphere was tense. It seemed as though the heavens were gone. and perhaps the earth would crack. The powerful to the ordinary Black saw the ordinary Black with pity, he said. And he hoped that he would not feel a pain akin to Martin's death again. At this point, when Martin dies, Martin is murdered, the radicalization began, but it was not an earnest beginning, because in 1956, 57, Blacks had begun arming themselves in North Carolina and Louisiana and other places to ward off armed marauders. And it was a real important thing to note that it was not just nonviolence that helped transform the South. For Deacons of Defense, the book by Lance Hill talks about that. Robert F. Williams, by Tim Tyson, Radio Free Dixie. It is important to understand that the transformation of the South and the idea of King as a somewhat worldly yet godly figure stands out because James Baldwin puts it best. Martin was love, baby. Martin wasn't just a preacher. Martin was what love was, because he actually believed in turning the other cheek. Baldwin would argue that the greatest thing that we can do in this society is love one another. And despite his anger and despite his eloquent rage and his writing, Baldwin would suggest a higher place in the human psyche and consciousness for love to abide. No matter how cynical he wrote at times, even toward the end of his life, when he was dying from cancer, he still believed in the idea of gospel as it embraces the ecumenical community and the body of believers. Now, I normally am a historian who talks about dates, but today Martin King and this idea of social gospel and what it meant. I also wanted to tell you, and I don't think I did it well enough, that history, but the idea that love could transform America faster than violence is appealing. And so a question was asked of me: police reform. Well, I believe social gospel would attempt to bring a meeting of the minds together. Number one, we try to bring the community and aggrieved. Number two, the second thing they would do is to find common ground. Third thing they would attempt to do is to reconcile the evils of the past by not ignoring them, but confronting them and attempting to move to a higher plane of understanding. Not that passionate love for man, but that love for your fellow man that Christ talks about. It is very difficult for people to conceive or conceptualize that. And a student last semester says, how I'm going to love somebody that's hitting on me. And my answer to them was, you got to figure out why they're hitting you. And you have two choices. Confront him with your evidence or hit him back. I argue that if you can show people how they hurt you, if their heart is in their chest, they will address their misdeeds towards you. And if that doesn't work, then smack them. Okay, Linda, next, any more questions?
Yes, we do have some questions.
Hey, Linda, okay.
Yes, you can hear me?
Sure.
Okay. How would social gospel
Yes.
form police, or would it abolish it?
No, even the call police to be abolished. What they're calling for is the practice of aggressive policing to be addressed within the context of its existing structure by creating a new paradigm of policing. Many people saw the fact growing up, community policing in northern cities was quite effective. But the police moved to, in the late 40s and early 50s, they moved to what I call a peripheral model of policing, where they police the perimeters of communities and go in and out to look for crime rather than to become part of the social melee of the communities that they exist. And so when people say they want to end, what they want to end is the evil that that men can be inherently evil, and that evil will infest the structure that exists. And so you change the police by one addressing the limits that men have and show that you are violating a certain code of ethics. And the next generation of cops will come in with a different idea of how to police people in the community. But what happens is, having been around police for a long time, in the new ways, the people who do what they call field training and on the job training tend to influence them more than the new way of policing. And so Rauschenbach and Niebuhr is the present, okay?
You had frozen.
Hello?
I
froze. Oh, did you hear me?
Just the very.
Okay, so I'm going to go back over that.
No, it was just at the very end when you froze.
Okay, so at the end, I was saying that what really has to happen is that has to change by bringing a more inclusive training reality by people who've been excluded from the mix, because every leadership group tries to find people who think like them. Police are no different than anybody else. The problem is, if that group of police have been found guilty of violence and other things against people, although no criminal charges have been found, group who don't value the use of force as part of that leadership group, but nobody was gone. That was a political tactic to gain votes rather than the idea. Nobody's that stupid. Nobody wants police to be gone. What they want is police to stop shooting you. Now that, to me, is logical. They personalize a societal problem because they're the ones who carry out. And so when people are saying is we got to change something, we can't keep going on this way. Next.
Are there any other questions? Do we have any questions for Dr. Watson? Dr. Watson, just to give some people to type in questions if they have any. Did you want to repeat the book?
Oh, they typed them in the chat. Here's one. You say the United States today, people do not agree on basic facts. How would Martin Luther King advise us? It's accountability, Truth and Reconciliation Commission, or something else. You need all of the above on that, and that one, Texas State. And Martin King's advice would be to place yourself in the position of those who are raising the call and ask yourself would you want to be treated that way. Some of this, I think, has to do with fear. And some of it has to do with the desire to hang on to what we call social control of others. King would advise us to, one, forgive, two, accept accountability, three, have a truth and reconciliation. And this King didn't do, Nelson Mandela did, that you can sit down and talk about this at first, but it worked in South Africa and it has worked in other places. The other thing is, and this is what Niebuhr and others would say, has a corruptive element to it. And organizations such as police and others become agents of those who are capitalist kings and princes. And so I'm not an economist, but I can tell you this. The police told me in the interviews that they don't serve us, they serve the elite. Okay, and I think there's one more. What was the jitney service? The jitney service appears in small towns, and I grew up in Little Rock, Arkansas, and they only had 2 cab services, the black and white cab, yellow cab service. My mother didn't drive. And so the cab service was kind of small. And she would go to the grocery store, she'd call a cab, and sometimes it would be, but there was a gentleman at the store who drove his car. He would take you home and he would take a small fee, usually $5 to $10 back in that time. And he was called a jitney driver, but prior to them granting license to African-American cabbies, the jitney service was a legitimate way that African Americans who didn't own the car got around if no bus or cab was available. Business class in certain places, some black cab companies started as jitneys and evolved into cab services themselves. Okay, and then I think this question says, how do we love someone who hates us? Now that's a good question. I'm still working on that one. But I do know and lay down each day. And we both have the same feelings about our family. And when we can establish some common ground, and we can establish that you have no greater capacity to hate me or dislike me than I have to hate you, so why don't we attempt to get along? Some reason is important. Okay, and here's one that says, what do you think, or what would Martin Luther King recommend to bring between Black Lives Matter and Blue Lives Matter groups? And where can we find common ground when current thinking? With this one, this is a real important one. Black Lives Matter is despised by Blue Lives Matter and whatever, vice versa. Black Lives Matter is a call of personal legitimacy by Black people saying to police and other leaders that our lives have value and you cannot take it with being held accountable for it. And the Blue Lives Matter group is saying that police lives matter, but the truth of the matter is, statistically, you're more likely to be shot by a white person than a Black person if you're a police officer. I've been one, so I've been with law enforcement a little bit, so I kind of know that. The other part of that is police has always had an issue with reconciliation with groups. They see it as an issue of weakness. And until we can get leadership that can come up with ways in which community and police operate as community and police, not Black lives or blue lives, but people, we are not going to get much reconciliation. You see, I firmly believe that when some person is killed unjustly, or the theory that they're killed to the community, because we see it over and over again. And police officers are doing a job, but it is affected by several things, and that's bias, implicit and explicit. If you can get and understand their biases, and that these biases don't make them bad people, just make their actions unacceptable, you can start to find some kind of common ground. But the common ground is going to be painfully bought, because both groups will have to confront the idea that they got to give and take from one another. Give and take is a very difficult thing. I don't know about y'all. I had 3 brothers, and I wasn't too much into that giving and taking stuff from them. When Mama said we could have ice cream, if I was the one giving out the ice cream, I got the most. So when my mother called you, who grew up with a mother who was all powerful in the house, you understand what that meant. I got my tail in trouble. But much like Black Lives and Blue Lives, me as a person who wanted to be in charge had to reconcile that I had no authority over my brothers, that my authority was to uphold the law. And so if upholding the law is what you're doing, then we must set in place laws that define the use of force, that hold people accountable for using force when it's not appropriate, and to hold people accountable for placing themselves in those positions when it is clear that occurred. Here's another one. How do I explain to my child that some people dislike you the color of your skin? I don't like broccoli. It's that simple to me. Some people don't like people, and that's just the way it is. And so tell your son, tell your daughter to love themselves and understand that some people just won't like you. But as long as you like you and you love and you treat people with dignity, it's gonna be okay. But nobody has the right to call you out of your name. Nobody has a right to mistreat you. But some people are pretty unlikable. So tell your son or daughter to work at loving them like Christ loved the church. Because love is a higher calling for us. And it disarms people when you can do that.
Are there any other questions?
One of the best books on King and Crozer is Taylor Branch's Parting the Waters. And the book by David Garrow also does a good job on his years at Crozer Seminary. Somebody asked me about Crozer. Crozer is closed now. It's now part of Colgate Rochester Crozer Seminary. Now there's a new PhD in African American preaching and gospel, and that's going to be really interesting. Because now it's not just a PhD in theology, it's a PhD in the history and culture of African American preaching.
Well, thank you. It was a very enjoyable and informative presentation, Dr. Watson.
Thank you.
I would also like to thank the City of Fort Worth's Diversity and Inclusion Department for helping support this program today. So I think that wraps things up for us. Thank you again, Dr. Watson.
Thank you.
It was a pleasure.
Thank you. It was a pleasure.